Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Adorian, and today I'm going to be telling you guys how I got A stars in IGCSE English Literature course code 0475. So I went viral a few years ago for getting all A stars on my IGCSEs, and ever since then I've been making IGCSE tips videos for all the subjects that I took, and finally we've gotten to English literature, which has been highly requested so far. But if you haven't already, you could check out the tips videos that I've made for all my other subjects, including the 4 sciences: biochem, physics, computer science. I did one on additional maths, and I did one on economics as well. Oh, and also English language. But yeah, as I said, today I will be talking about English literature. There are quite a few IGCSE variations for this subject. For example, there's also world literature as an IGCSE course. So if you're doing one of those courses, you could also take some of the tips from this video, which I'm sure will be useful since there is a lot of overlap. And yeah, without further ado, let's just get started right now. So this is going to be a little bit complicated because for the IGCSE English Literature course, there are like different variations of the papers that you take. So I'll put a screenshot here, but everybody has to do paper 1. But then some people do a paper 2, some people do a paper 3 and a paper 4, and then some people do a paper 3 and a component 5. So to my knowledge, this is like only chosen by your school. And for me personally, I did the option where I had 3 papers. So I did paper 1, paper 3, and paper 4. So I'll be mainly talking about those today, but like since it's all English literature, the tips kind of like go with each other anyway. So yeah, let's just get started with paper 1, which is the paper with poetry and prose, and it is worth 50% of your grade. You get 1 hour and 30 minutes, and for this paper there's going to be 2 questions on 2 texts. One of them will obviously be your poetry, and one of them will be your prose. And these are based off of what you've been studying in class for the past like 1.5-ish years of your IGCSE course. And again, the set texts are appointed by your teacher. So we've probably done different texts, but like the basis is still the same. But anyway, section A of this paper is going to be your poetry. So in class, you would have studied a poem collection of 50 different poems selected by, the examiner's board at Cambridge. And for me personally, I did Songs of Ourselves, Volume 1 from Part 4. And for the poem collections, I'm pretty sure the examination board, they cycle through the different collections for every exam year. So currently there's going to be different options for the poetry collection for May-June 2026. But anyway, for each poetry collection in the exam, you're going to get 2 out of the 15 poems that will come up in the exam. And then you're going to get a question for each poem. And then you have to choose one of those poems that you feel more comfortable with, and you're going to write that entire essay on. And then for section B of the paper, which is on the prose, it will be of the book that you've been learning in class for like the past few years. And again, this is also chosen by your teacher out of the set text. Me personally, I did Life of Pi by Jan Martel, but I'm pretty sure the set texts have changed every single year. But anyway, for section B, you're going to get 2 questions for your text. One of them will be based on a passage that they'll give you from the text, which is usually like 1 to 2 pages. And another one will just be a general question where you can take things from the text. Me personally, I always did the passage question option because I preferred like having a visual stimulus available, which I could like just take direct quotations from. And I found that that worked better for me. But obviously to each their own. You can decide yourself which question you feel more comfortable with and would rather go with, just like for the poetry collection. But anyway, for both of these essays, since they're done within 1 hour and 30 minutes, it is quite the time crunch. So if you do the calculations, each essay should only take up 45 minutes of your time. And out of those 45 minutes, you need to at least be planning for 5 minutes. Okay, that's the very least. And you should also save 5 minutes at the end to read through and, check all your grammar mistakes and language, spelling mistakes, whatever. So effectively, you only have 35 minutes to write your essay. So how do you do that, you may ask? Well, I have written down like my exam test taking strategy, and this goes for both of the 2 essays. So just like copy and paste it in your head. So the first step is to obviously identify the keywords in the question. Now, for IGCSE essay prompts, they're usually not too specific and they're generally a lot more broad. So you do have a lot of freedom with like what you actually decide to write your essay on, but still circle, highlight, whatever, annotate the keywords in your prompt. And then next for step 2, as you read through your poem again, even though you studied it in class, but as you read through your poem and your passage again, just highlight like all the things that are directly relevant to the key point from the question and just make really brief annotations of how it relates back to the question. And by the end of that, you should have a collection of quotes that you can reference in your essay. And this should be like less than 10 for sure, but like more than 5 at least. So then what I do is that I sort it out into 3 key points to break down the 3 different main points of focus that I will be answering the question prompt with. Okay, so that's that. And then now it comes to actually writing the essay. So obviously you're going to have your structure. So just like with basically any other essay that you do in your academic career, it's going to be an introduction, 3 points, and then a conclusion. So for introduction, since time is really tight, I'd say personally that the introduction doesn't really have that much of an impact. In fact, like my English literature teacher during IGCSE literally told me that like all you have to do is just write 1 sentence because the bulk of the marks come from your analysis in the 3 points. So just keep your introduction extremely brief. So for the poem or the general prose question, you can just tightly outline like whatever you're going to say. And if you choose the prose passage question, then you can just kind of contextualize where that passage from the text comes from. So you can say something like, this moment in the novel happens when blah, blah, blah. And the purpose of the introduction is simply just to like define your focus and let the examiner know like around what you're going to say. But in general, it's really not that deep, as I said. But the deep parts comes when you have to do the 3 points of focus. So my strategy for each point of focus is to start each paragraph with an extremely clear topic sentence that uses those keywords from your prompt question. So how I would do this in the essay is for the first point of focus, I just say one way that blah, 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 blah from the question is by whatever your key point is. And then for the next one, it'll be another way that blank is through blank, which is your second way. And then the third one, I'll just say the final way is by blank. And I'll have each of these 3 key points in mind when I'm in the previous step of like planning my essay and highlighting everything. So for each key point of focus, you want to be choosing 2 to 3 quotes that appropriately demonstrate what you're trying to say. Honestly, for me, I used to only do 2 quotes for each point of focus because I wanted to write a lot about them, but I obviously didn't have time to do that within 35 minutes. So I think choosing 2 is fine, but obviously 3 is optimum because you're giving a wider range of stuff. But basically for each quote that you do choose, there is a strategic way to analyze it for IGCSE standards. So the first thing is to say the quote in the context. Secondly, you have to say what it literally means, like what the actual meaning of it is. And for this, try your best to use synonyms of the words from the quotes. So you show the examiner that you actually understand what the quote is saying, which is especially important for poetry since, you know, language can be a little bit more strange there. And then after you talk about the literal meaning, you can then level up and talk about the figurative meaning, which is basically like what this specific quote symbolizes or what's like the hidden meaning of this, what's the broader meaning. And you can break down each part of the quote and you can pick out words directly from the quote that are more special and use things like literary devices or just fancier language that you can analyze and pick out. But the key thing is that for each thing that you extract from the quote, you have to be demonstrating the implication. And what I mean by that is you have to state explicitly, so what? So like, so what? Like, why is there a simile there? Like, what effect does that have on the rest of the text and like on the audience taking it in? And I think that skill is seriously just what you need to level up in like a band mark range, because simply stating like all the poetic devices and like all the metaphors, hyperboles, whatever that the poet is using, that's not enough because you're not demonstrating your understanding of that. You're more so just like listing the things that you're noticing. But yeah, in order to get a better grade, you have to be explaining like what the purpose of that is. And you want to be doing that for each point of focus. And yeah, that's basically the structure that you want to be using for both essay questions in paper 1. And now I'm just going to get into some specific tips for poetry and prose. So first, for poetry, what I tried to do was to include quotes from each part of the poem given. And my strategy was to just divide the poem into 3 parts, like 3/3, and have a key point of focus that is relevant to the quotes from each third, so that I could make sure that I covered the entire poem, because obviously you don't want to just be focusing on one section if the question is more so asking about, the entire poem as a whole. And I found that splitting it into 3/3 is especially effective because it's also in chronological order. So the key points of focus, they kind of make sense as you read along the essay, because it's like developing as the poem goes. Okay, next, the second thing is critical engagement with your text. And this kind of links back to what I was just saying, but basically for each point that you're making, you want to be using words like because, since, as, so, like stuff like that can actually show how the writer's choices of language and structure achieve the specific effects that you want to mention. And by doing this, you can also link every single thing that you state back into the main question that is being asked. And I feel like to examiners, this shows that you're appropriately engaging with the poem and you know what you're doing. My third tip is to avoid being overly narrative. So you don't need to be retelling the poem, as in you don't have to be like narrating the events that's going on in the poem, since this essay is more so quizzing your analysis and not your like synthesis skills from reading something. And now for how I personally revise for my poetry collection is I basically had a Google Doc where I obviously had all of my 15 poems. And then to revise for this exam, for each poem, I just picked out the quotes and key points of focus that I wanted to mention. And I don't think that I memorized everything like word for word exactly before my actual exam. But I feel like doing this really helped me not only just practice the skill of picking out key points, but it also just like planted a seed in my memory. So then when I actually opened the exam paper and I got one of the random poems, I would have a brief idea of what I intended to say. So I'm just going to show you guys an example for what my revision doc looked like. So as you can see, it looks extremely messy, but for each poem I made like a Google drawing and highlighted the quotes that I wanted to use. So this one is for the poem The Planners by Bowie Kim Cheng. And as you can see, I divided it by 3 colors, so pink, yellow, and blue for my 3 key points of focus. And for this one, I did not want to split the poem into thirds because I found that there were 3 key themes that I could write about. And yeah, for that reason, I didn't really want to split it into thirds. So yeah, as you can see, the headings are my key points of focus. So one is about power, one is about excessive control, and one is about the destruction of the past for the construction of the city. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but this is kind of just what the poem is about. So then for each box, that's referring to one of the quotes. So let's just look at one of them. Okay, so for this one, I have in gray text the literal meaning of the quote. And then I just have bullet point notes of the specific language used or the literary devices used. For example, anaphoras, caesuras, monosyllabic words, personification, like all that kind of stuff. And then I have an arrow and I kind of just elaborate on the effects of those things that I wanted to memorize. And like here it looks really choppy, and looking back, like it might not make sense to, somebody who's looking at this without reading, an essay that I wrote for this poem. But it's basically just like keywords that are quite technical for English that explain the quote and kind of just jog my memory of what I want to say about each quote. And yeah, I just did that for every single quote, and I did that for every single poem, which I know is quite extra, but if you want to be prepared, that's what you can do. And yeah, since you do get a choice of 2 poems in the actual exam, you can afford to not study for 1 poem in your poetry collection, which I did because there was one poem that I just like really didn't understand and I did not want to do. And I knew that if I got it, I wouldn't write about it anyway. So yeah, but I wouldn't recommend, skipping revising for more than that, because just imagine you get 2 of the poems you didn't revise for and you're kind of just like damned for the exam and you'll start freaking out. which is not great because you only have 45 minutes, as I said. But okay, anyway, that's for poem. Now for part 2, for prose, it's really similar, but for the quotes from the passage, I just chose like 6 to 7 relevant quotes again. But I would say that the key thing for choosing quotes for the prose is that you want to choose quotes that demonstrate a range of things, like a range of language, a range of different structural devices that the writer uses. So you can show broader knowledge of, you know, the English language in general. And there's also just like more to comment on and analyze so that it doesn't come off as too repetitive. And again, what I did for quotes for the passage is that I also divided it into 3/3. And again, that just worked out better because it's also in like chronological order. And another tip for the prose bit is that while you're writing your essay, you can be drawing further links to the rest of the text that's not in the passage that they gave to you. And I feel like this is especially good because, you know, you're showing that you actually read the book, you know what you're doing, and you can talk about stuff like foreshadowing and also other symbols that might have appeared in other parts of that entire book itself. But obviously, in order to do that, you need like a very solid understanding of your book. And in order to have a very solid understanding of your book, you have to make sure that you're revising well. And personally, what I did was that I wrote bullet point notes for all of the main themes that happen in my book. I also wrote about character relationships and symbols. So I had notes on all these things, and I knew that in the passage given in the exam, like quite a big chunk of these main themes, character relationships, symbols would come up in that passage because they're simply just like sprinkled all throughout the text. So in revising that, I had a lot of confidence that I could like recycle something from my notes that I previously thought so that I could like make the connection in my head again. You know what I mean? And I feel like this would help a lot because you already have the storage of that stuff in your head. And when you come to the exam and you're on a strict time crunch, you won't freak out too much because you already know it. And I would say that also usually the passage that gets chosen for this, usually, it's either during one of the conflicts or a chunk from the ending of the book, but that doesn't mean that it's exclusive to those things. So like obviously still, you know, make sure that you know your book well, but like, yeah, I feel like those are just more likely to come up. Okay, now that's all I have for paper 1. Now I'm gonna get into paper 3, but my tips will also apply to the paper 2 if you're doing that. But paper 3 is a drama paper about a play that you've studied in class. And then for the paper 3 one, it's gonna be 45 minutes and it's worth 25% of your grade. And for me personally, I did Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire, and I'm pretty sure that actually is on the set text list for this exam year, so you might be doing the same one as me too. But anyway, for paper 3, you can bring in your book because it is an open book exam. However, they are very strict on it, having no notes, highlighting, annotations of any sort whatsoever. So you basically just have to bring in a clean copy. And honestly, I'm not gonna lie, like there isn't much time in the exam for you to be flipping through those pages. So yeah, I don't think I actually referenced the book in my exam because I already knew what I was gonna say. But yeah, just letting you guys know that like you do have that for some sort of moral support. And then similar to the prose essay, you get a choice of 2 questions. So you can either choose to answer a question based off a passage that they take from the text, or you can answer a general question. And again, I chose the passage one because I just thought that that was easier for me. And yeah, same thing. This is going to be 45 minutes. So you have 35 minutes to actually write your essay. And honestly, this essay uses the exact same structure with introduction, 3 points, and then conclusion. So you can just follow what I said in the paper 1 section of this video. But just for general tips for the drama essay, you should be referencing other parts of the text just like for the prose. And to do this, you can actually memorize quotes beforehand about other parts of the drama that you want to use. Or you can also make indirect references, which means like stating what happened in another part of the book, but not having the exact quotation to support that. And that's what I usually did because I just could not be asked to, you know, memorize that many quotes and have it all in my head. But I feel like both ways kind of have the same effect of, you know, showing that you know your drama well. And a tip that applies specifically to the drama essay is that you should be analyzing the structure and the form of the play as well as dramatic techniques and not just the use of language. So contrary to poetry and prose, which are more heavy on how the writer uses language and uses all those literary devices. For the play, you do want to do that, but you also want to talk about the things that make it distinctly a play. So those are the things like staging, which includes lighting, setting, sound, props, and also things like stage directions, just stuff like that that are more specific to the play. And there's honestly like so many things you can say about this. Like the amount of like interpretations that you can have for something are basically endless, as long as you justify and explain your claims well enough that your side also makes sense to the examiner reading it. And how to revise for the drama, basically what I did was also really similar to the prose. Like I just made bullet point notes on what I could say about each character. Since for plays, there's generally fewer characters which are always appearing. So for example, for A Streetcar Named Desire, I just did it on all of the main characters like Blanche, Stella, Stanley, Mitch, and also just like smaller notes on the few side characters. And then for each character, I just made notes on like the defining traits that make that character who they are, since those things obviously are going to show up in the sample of the text that they choose, because they're just like recurring things about the character that you can just write analysis on. And other than that, you should also be making notes on common symbols and motifs that occur throughout the play, since they'll be quite relevant to the play and thus like easier to analyze, and show that you have deeper thinking about like, the broader meaning of things. And then lastly, for paper 4, this is going to be the unseen, which is going to be slightly longer by 30 minutes. So it's 1 hour and 15 minutes, and it's weighted 25% as well. Now, I'm not sure how much of the IGCSE population does this paper, and does this like paper pathway option. So I'm just going to run through this a little bit faster, because the tips are honestly, they're all quite similar throughout English literature, if you couldn't tell. But yeah, I'm just going to add some specific tips that I have for this paper in case you are doing it. So for this one, you get to choose from an unseen poem or an unseen passage from a prose, which will just be 1 page. And personally, I always chose poem because I like analyzing poems more, and I feel like I'm better at it, since I feel like throughout my schooling, I got really, really, really familiar with like every single possible thing that you can say about a poem. But yeah, at the same time, I know a lot of people who would rather go for the prose. So it's honestly just up to personal preference. But yeah, in the IGCSE exam, for each unseen, they actually do give you 3 bullet points of things that they say you might consider to help you answer the question. So for me in the exam, what I did is that I used these bullet points that they give you for free, and then I base each one of my key points of focus on each of those bullet points. So while I'm going through and planning my essay, I use different highlighters for each of the 3 bullet points, and then I just highlight the quotes that are relevant to that bullet point. Then I fine tune and choose which ones I want to use for my actual essay. And also while I'm annotating my unseen, I just write brief points of what I could say just while the ideas are all flowing in my head. So yeah, same thing again, just like poetic literary devices or just any other keywords that you want to note down quickly in case you forget. And then for writing the essay itself, obviously same structure, same thing. But yeah, the important thing is that after each key point of focus, you write a sentence that kind of summarizes that key point and links it back to what the prompt is asking. And again, the prompts for the unseen are quite general and they're quite lax. Like it's usually always something like, how does the writer or how does the poet make this poem memorable or make this poem striking? Like obviously, like these are quite vague and it's not really pinpointed on a certain thing that you should be looking for. So what I'm saying is that like almost everything can answer the question. You just have to show like why and show how. And that's just the key thing in this entire course. And yeah, that's all for my paper specific tips. And since time is running really short for me right now, I'm just gonna rapid fire some general tips that you should be using for English language. So I feel like one of the key things that I've been saying and repeating all throughout this video is that you should always show the significance of every claim that you're trying to make, and also show the relation to the rest of the text, whether that's your drama or your novel. So that's one thing. Second thing, time management is extremely crucial. Like you really do not have much time to be writing these essays. So make sure that you're not getting like lost in your head, and just make sure to keep looking at the clock to just know how much time you have left. Also for paper 1, since you have to independently switch between the poetry to the prose essay on your own. Like, nobody's going to tell you when 45 minutes is over. You have to be making sure and keeping track of that yourself. And if you think that you're not going to finish your poetry essay and like you didn't write a conclusion or something, I think it's fine to just skip that and just go straight to the prose essay, because then you have a higher chance of getting more marks. And obviously if you finish the prose faster, you can always come back to the poetry one, but you just don't want to be like left with a whole entire essay to do in like 20 minutes, you know what I mean? So yeah, budget your time wisely. But to avoid that scenario, obviously do a lot of practice. Like, you can just do practice essays, time yourself, see how long it takes you to write an essay, see how well you can write an essay without your notes at hand, and like how much you actually memorize from the notes that you've already made. And yeah, those are just my key tips for practicing for English literature. And I really hope that this video helped you in some way, shape, or form. If you do have any questions for me, you can obviously leave them in the comments down below. And make sure to check out the rest of my IGCSE tips video series for more tips from a person who actually experienced it herself. And yeah, I will be making an 0607 math video soon for the last subject in this long IGCSE video series of mine. But yeah, if you have any other things that you possibly want me to make a video on, I'm happy to do so. So feel free to just drop a comment down below. And yeah, other than that, just make sure to subscribe, turn on post notifications so you know when I post my next video. Make sure to like this video so that the algorithm knows that I know what I'm saying. And thank you guys so much for watching, and I will be seeing you guys in the next video. Bye!